One summer morning in 1967, a battered American ship pulled into the port of Valletta. 6 days earlier, on the 8th of June, the USS Liberty had been attacked. A torpedo had blown a huge hole in the ship's side, leaving her lower decks flooded.
Everybody in the space that I worked in died, except me.
Lost too was some of America's most sensitive electronic intelligence equipment, because the Liberty was a spy ship.
The Liberty should not have been there.
It was no enemy that tried to sink the Liberty. It was America's ally, Israel, then fighting its Arab neighbors in the Six-Day War. The survivors have always said the attack was no accident.
We were well known, and the attack was obviously deliberate. I consider it this cold-blooded murder of American sailors that day.
Yet Israel insists it was a tragic case of mistaken identity.
It's very embarrassing for a military force like the Israeli Defense Forces to make such a blunder, no doubt. But we admit our mistake. That does not mean that there was any intention or any conspiracy or anything of the sort.
But the men of the Liberty claim there was a conspiracy, and that it's been covered up for 35 years.
If it was an accident, it was the best planned accident I've ever heard of.
If Jews today can gather at their holiest site, the Wailing Wall, it's because the Six-Day War brought them control of Jerusalem's old city. It's also brought 35 years of violence, hatred, and bloodshed. Since 1967, Israel has become the dominant power in the Middle East, thanks to its alliance with the US.
It was a turning point in our relationship with Israel. Up until that point, we had avoided being a major arms supplier to Israel. Paradoxically, the security of Israel became one of our strategic objectives, which it had never been in the past.
For 35 years, the Liberty veterans have been campaigning for justice and a full inquiry into the attack on their ship.
We need you because it's what keeps us going. We can't do the things we want to do without your help.
We have never learned why it happened that day, why the ravage of war came in our way. We lost our husbands, sons, and friends, and there is no hope our hearts will mend. Oh, the liberty.
For many young men in mid-60s America, joining the Navy was a good alternative to Army service.
It was kind of funny. I didn't want to go. It was Vietnam. My friends were coming back in body bags, and I put it off for a month. I got a second notice, and I figured I better do something, and I went and enlisted in the Navy, and went into the Navy and 13 weeks later after boot camp, I got onto the USS Liberty.
Rankowski didn't yet know it, but the Liberty would also be on her way to war. While America was distracted by Vietnam, the Soviet Union was extending its influence in the Middle East. It backed radical governments in Syria and Egypt, whose president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had become the Arab world's chief spokesman in its struggle with Israel.
Egypt was under enormous pressure at the time. Pressure by the Arab partners. I remember the Jordanians calling President Nasser and telling him, "You are only bragging, you are not doing anything, you are letting down your Syrian allies," and things like that. And they saw it as a necessity to do something to help.
Meanwhile, the USS Liberty had crossed the Atlantic and put in at the West African port of Abidjan. Some of the sailors were on leave and busy with their home movie cameras. The Liberty was an unarmed ship designed to listen in on electronic communications and pass intelligence on to the highest levels of the US government. There was no other ship like her. Her decks bristled with 45 antennas, and below were dozens of communications analysts and translators.
If it was broadcast on a radio wave, we could receive it at any frequency, low frequency, high frequency, medium frequency, very low frequency. If it was out there, we could receive it. If we were listening and we heard a signal, and when we looked at it, we couldn't understand it, it was encrypted as well, we'd send it back to NSA and let them hit it with their computers.
NSA, the National Security Agency, is America's top secret organization for handling electronic intelligence. From its headquarters outside Washington, it controlled the Liberty as she cruised slowly along the west coast of Africa. In May '67, Nasser moved thousands of Egyptian troops into the previously demilitarized Sinai Peninsula. Israel and Egypt now confronted each other head-on, though the saber-rattling didn't mean war was inevitable. Then Nasser raised the stakes. He closed the Straits of Tiran, cutting off the Israeli port of Eilat. Israel saw this as an act of war and began to mobilize. In fact, Hawks and the Israeli government had been waiting for a showdown with the Arabs. Both sides now prepared for war. Soon to be caught up in this was the USS Liberty. Her commander, William L. McGonigal, had been in the Navy since World War II. The crew included highly trained code breakers and radio experts, like Dave Lewis.
I was the research officer on the research ship. The commanding officer drove the ship, the executive officer was his assistant, and I was in charge of the 195 security group personnel. We were sent around the world wherever there might be a hot spot to see if we could determine what was going on and if the United States desired any intervention of any sort.
Life aboard the USS Liberty was like no other naval life. And in the 1960s, ships of that ilk operated independently. The commanding officer of the USS America, which was the flagship of the Sixth Fleet, didn't keep track of a ship that was sailing all by itself. When we were off duty, when the sailors were off duty, we went up topside and sunbathed. I mean, we wore pressed, starched, creased uniforms and spit-shine shoes. And